Now, when you were studying the public financing in general, did you concentrate primarily on other cities that had done this, or did you also kind of look at state programs and whatnot?
I focused primarily on other cities and was helped out by the Center for Governmental Studies in LA, which has already done a lot of this studying.
Yeah,
so fortunately, I didn't have to do all the homework myself, but I was able to dig up the results of what other cities had done, whether it had worked, whether it had not worked. There were a few state examples in there, but the key was to determine who's doing a full program, who's doing a partial program, and where do they get the money from, which is where the rubber meets the road on this issue.
Yeah.
There are many people...
Always that pesky thing of how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, with everything in government, of course. And there are a number of people who have a visceral negative reaction at the idea of giving taxpayer money to politicians. And that's understandable. What's interesting in Sunnyvale is we can make the point, we're already doing it. We already have a tiny public financing program, and that the city of Sunnyvale, by council vote back in the early 90s, said that any candidate that gets signatures on a form from 250 registered voters will have their ballot statement paid for by the city. So that's about a $2,000 per candidate public financing program. So we already have one in place, so now it's just a question of how big it gets.
Expanding it a little bit, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on giving taxpayer dollars to public officials or candidates to run for office, and that sort of visceral resistance on the part of voters. This comes up a lot in the volunteer work that I do, explaining to people how public financing in general works, and I work a lot on the state program for California. And which has been going really well here lately, by the way. Our bill for public financing of the Secretary of State's office passed the Assembly last year, and then this year we were approved by the Senate Elections Committee, which was a new high water mark for us. And then, lo and behold, we went on to the Senate Appropriations Committee, and we were approved there also. But what we try to explain to people is that the objection sometimes comes across as, well, I don't want my tax dollars going to pay for some candidate's political speech that I don't agree with. And so what we encourage them to look at is that as taxpayers, all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, we're not really paying to support any particular candidate or any particular political point of view. The money that's used to subsidize the public financing system, it comes from the general pool, so it's one of those things that we all contribute to. And the whole idea is that we're paying for something, a system, which is going to help level the playing field. It's going to help there be more participants in the whole process. It's going to allow candidates to run who might not otherwise have been able to run. So we as voters are going to have more choices. We're going to hear more ideas and get input from more different places. And that whole process makes the whole democratic electoral process a more fair and more democratic thing. It's a public good that we all benefit from if elections are like that. And the candidates that we get to choose among are not just the candidates who wealthier private interests have chosen to support. It can be anyone who can demonstrate that they've got grassroots support in the community and who agrees to the voluntary spending limit. We're going to have a much better pool of candidates and that everyone benefits from that. So as a public good, it makes perfect sense that we publicly finance it. And we publicly finance every other aspect of the election. We pay for our public officials' offices, their office staff, their office equipment. We pay for all the staff for the electoral process itself at the Register of Voters and so on. We pay to print up the ballots. I mean, the whole electoral process, for good reason, being a public good, is publicly financed. So the only thing we've left out so far is how do these candidates get their message out to the voters so that the voters can decide which one of them they want to have represent them. So we encourage people to consider it, look at it as a public good and something that we're all going to benefit from.
And certainly it's reasonable for any voter to say, if you're thinking of spending my tax money on something, what do I get out of it, or what does my city get out of it? And the answer is you get more choices on the ballot. It's at Sunnyvale, at the city level, that's the goal here. Is it's more likely that there will be someone running for city council that you'll agree with. There are people you would like to see running for city council who are not running because they can't afford it. If we do this, then some more people who agree with you will be on the ballot. And that's a direct benefit to those people.
Yeah.
The issues you brought up about the state, there's a different level of problem up at the state where you have groups that control huge amounts of money and have a very large influence on how the election goes. And so your phrase of leveling the playing field really comes into bear there. At the city level, we looked into that. We have only 2 groups that are particularly active in town. And our perception on the committee was that the playing field is not unlevel. What's more, there is a bit of a risk if you do a full financing program that basically says, okay, those groups are not going to be allowed to make direct contributions to those candidates. What they all do anyway is then they become independent expenditures, and they go off and spend that same money they would have spent in some way that's not controlled by the candidate. And that can be problematic. Now, up at the state level, you'll have issues like, okay, if one candidate has someone that does an independent expenditure, then the other candidate can get additional public financing to keep the playing field level. And the case of Sunnyvale, where the groups that do that typically contribute about $2,000, $2,500. If we had a spending limit of $50,000 and a subsidy of $25,000, those groups can still make those contributions direct to those candidates, and there's no incentive for them to go out and do independent expenditures. And that was one of the key reasons why we're recommending only a partial subsidy instead of the full subsidy. At the state level, you might have to go to the full subsidy.
Right. Now you mentioned about a couple of groups in Sunnyvale that are particularly influential. Well, I have 2 questions. One is there a limit on the size contribution that they can make directly to a candidate?
No, we have no contribution limits in Sunnyvale.
So then that sort of leads into my second question, which is, if among the cast of candidates for a particular council seat, those 2 major groups select one or 2, maybe they pick the same one or whatever, if having garnered the support of those 2 groups, does it then put the other 1 or 2 or at a financial disadvantage, having not been the one that was anointed by those groups?
It certainly can. I had 2 opponents in 2005, and one of the groups that tends to endorse candidates is called SunPAC. It's the political action committee that was spun out of the Chamber of Commerce. So it represents the local business community, people who are very concerned about making sure the economy stays good. And one of my opponents in 2005 was a small businessman. And I remember after we had the SunPAC interviews, he said to me, this is my community. If I don't get this endorsement, I might as well fold my tent. I felt kind of bad because, it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to get that endorsement. And he didn't fold his tent. But, he was at somewhat of a disadvantage. But the financial disadvantage that the Sunnyvale Public Safety Officers Association, the other group that tends to be involved in elections, and SunPAC provide is not crippling to the other candidate. So we don't feel that's really a big problem. And we also,
it's not a death blow to the opponent's candidacy.
I know my opponent felt it might have been a death blow, but I'm not sure it really was. And the Public Safety Officers Association endorsed one of my opponents. And obviously that was not a death blow to me. So, one can survive these things if one walks enough precincts. That's what really wins elections, and that's what's free.